Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my December 2025 reading wrap-up video, which I'm filming over MLK weekend. In fact, I am wearing the name tag that I had on at my synagogue. We do a volunteer day in honor of this weekend, wearing it like it's some sort of excuse for being so late with this wrap-up. But here we are, here we have it, halfway or more into January, and I'm finally ready to sit down and talk about my end of year reading. I got a late start with things. One thing I like to do before making this video is to put up my monthly literary newsletter. So in my newsletter, I recap literary news that caught my interest, and I have snippets of the Goodreads reviews that first I had to write for these books that I read this past month, and I have a book pick, a book quote, etc. That is linked in the description bar down below. And with that, I guess I'll just get into it. Maybe I can just keep things a little short and sweet, because I know that, the sun is definitely set on 2025, and I want to move forward into reading and recapping and reviewing, more January stuff. But anyway, it was a good wrap-up to the year. Some 3 stars, some 4 stars, interesting stuff. A little few surprises to my usual, structured schedule. And I guess then I'll start with this book, which is The Summer of Broken Rules by K.L. Walther. This wasn't on my radar at all. In fact, it was a holiday gift that I talked about in my book haul, my last book haul. My niece gave it to me. It was a complete cover buy, so I feel a little less bad for the fact that I didn't really get on with this book because she knew about as much about it as I did, that the cover was really pretty. For me, this is probably the highlight of the book, but I think otherwise this author might be relatively popular, maybe in book talk spaces for YA rom-com. Perhaps there's also some Taylor Swift references that are pretty much entirely over my head, so unfortunately I couldn't get much enjoyment out of those either. But to recap, in this rom-com, our main character is Meredith, who recently graduated from high school and is like deciding, if she's going to go to college or not. But in the immediate term, she is going to Martha's Vineyard, where her family's been vacationing for years, and now her cousin is getting married there, and they're having like a week of festivities. But this is the first time she's gone to Martha's Vineyard ever since her older sister died in a tragic accident. And so she's supposed to kind of be reclaiming her life. She also just went through a bad breakup, and of course, instead of moving on to, friends and family, she has a comedic run-in with a new suitor who happens to be the stepbrother of the groom. And luckily enough, I guess for them, this family has this competitive streak where they like to play the game Assassin, which is they all take up water guns, and they each, get a name of a competitor that they have to, hunt down and kill. And then once, kill, and once you kill them, you acquire their name of who they have to hunt down until, you get down to a victor. Apparently the sister loved this game, so it's supposed to be in her memory. The love interest, Whit, and Meredith basically team up immediately. Whit is competitive and very good at the game and very jocular about it when, of course, he's on top. Then when he is not so much on top and things don't go his way, he gets a bit thin-skinned about it. Shocking. Surprise, surprise. That's one thing about these contemporary rom-coms I read. I never seem to like the love interest, at least not in the straight ones. I don't know. This is just, that's just the, one of the things that was off for me. It is a whirlwind romance for over a week. It's supposed to be YA, but it doesn't feel like YA the way that she's, Meredith is, sneaking around with him, and her parents barely seem to care. And her friend, one of her friends, challenges her, like, aren't you supposed to, be hanging out with us? And it seems like her excuse is, you just don't know what it feels like to have lost a sister. What does that have to do with you chasing this man, all these years later? So it's just, peak annoyance to me. And so, yeah, this type of thing, is not my thing. My niece also is not a rom-com fan, so she should probably learn to read covers better. So anyway, I have this hope that maybe historical romance will be more in my wheelhouse if I ever get to it, because once again, the contemporary is not doing much for me. The next book I'll talk about briefly is Loss of Memory is Only Temporary by Johanna Kaplan. This is a collection of short stories and one novella, which I discussed about at some length in a video I did earlier in December, because I read these night by night over Hanukkah and, just reviewed them alongside my menorah. And it was a fun project, although I wouldn't say I was head over heels in love with this collection. This is a living author, although most of her work is from mid-century, and I think a lot of her associations, even though they're kind of classic Jewish American Ashkenazi associations, I don't personally connect with as much in the 21st century, and she kind of just dumps us into every story and expects us to keep up with it, and so I had some trouble. I also just generally have trouble with humor in fiction because it might be a mix of bad things, taking myself too seriously, not having enough of an attention span to, latch on to as much cleverness as I need. I'm being hard on myself. Maybe I'm being too hard on myself. I mean, with time, reading this collection and reading responses to this collection, there were some stories that stuck out to me particularly. The one that I kept coming back to had to do with an experience at a Zionist summer camp in the 50s, which the narrator wasn't feeling all that connected to, but there was an interesting way in which they were not talking about the Holocaust, but sort of play acting the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising at a time when the survivors weren't talking about the Holocaust. That stuck with me. So again, I'm more thinking about the drama of it all. There's also an essay in here which is about her great-grandparents, which is much more straightforward, and that appealed to me a lot more, and it's a very similar backstory to my own ancestral backstory, in terms of geography anyway. But there's even also a story in here, because most of them are pretty much autofiction, but there is one story where she really stretches her wings and takes on the perspective of a Vietnamese person of Chinese descent with political leanings toward the Viet Cong and Maoism, I believe. So that's a bit different. From here, I'll go mostly in order of chronological reading as well as I remember it all this time later. This is starting with Provenance by Ann Leckie, a science fiction book that's been sitting on my shelves for a while. Then I took it off due to my BookTube Spin TBR game. And I am glad I got to it, and in a way I'm surprised I didn't like it more, because it's a book that's less about, high-octane badassery type of stuff, and more about politics and intrigue in that arena, but I did feel like the characters were a little one-note, and I just couldn't get myself quite as invested in understanding the intricate world building. Although I have read one other of Leckie's books in this world, not her most famous series, Ancillary Justice, but another book. But anyway, in this space opera, we're following In Gray. She lives on a system and with a family where she wants to gain some political clout because her mother's a big, presence that is looking to name an heir, and will probably name her brother, but she wants to make a name for herself, so she kidnaps this man who was accused of selling ancient relics, and these are so important that if he could divulge where they were, that would be of some influence, but the story is much more complicated than that ultimately. And then ultimately a murder happens, so we have to just figure out who murdered who and why. And she gets embroiled in all of that. In Gray is a really likable character, so, you just want to root for her. And her brother is not, and more than not being likable, he's supposed to be, the one with more political prowess, but he isn't. He is too stuck in his ways for that. So, basically we're following her, and she's learning what we already know is that, she's worth it, and she's, good enough, and she's putting herself on the line to, for her ideals, and, she is worth it to follow in a sort of unchallenging way. So I just found this kind of middle of the road. Next, I'll talk about Specimen Days by Michael Cunningham. This is the start of my author's backlist challenge that I try to make for myself every December, where I read 3 books from an author's backlist that I like. Of course, it didn't quite work out as I planned. This is the only book of the 3 that I read in December, but I'm going to continue on with reading Michael Cunningham into 2026, because in fact I am in the final batch of his fiction. And then I think I'll have read all of the fiction that he's written. And this one, Specimen Days, is the book he wrote most immediately after The Hours, which I believe to date is his most famous book. It was made into a movie. And this is somewhat similar. I guess he tried to sort of repeat the pattern in a way, because in that book we had 3 storylines and 3 timelines, and everybody was connected to Virginia Woolf, including one character being Virginia Woolf. This is slightly different, but slightly the same. We have 3 storylines, 3 timelines, and everyone's connected more metaphysically to Walt Whitman. And Specimen Days comes from his oeuvre of work, and there's just a broader theme as well about, I guess, his appeal to naturalism over overt technology, and in all of these storylines, technology is somewhat threatening. And the first story takes place at the turn of the century with an Irish-American family, immigrant family in New York. The second story is somewhat contemporary, I think mostly slightly post 9/11, also in New York. All of these are New York, and we're following a forensic psychologist who is trying to track down this spooky group of kids who are of killing people in the name of returning to naturalism. And then in the final story, it's actually a near future story where human life has kind of has been repleted. It seems like we actually are somewhat more in a naturalistic state of events, in that human society is much diminished, and most of the country isn't all that functional anymore. And some survivors, including aliens and androids, are actually trying to find a better life using technology, I guess, to get off the planet. You know, it's the sort of thing where, you know, he's a literary fiction writer, and so it doesn't always work when literary fiction writers move into sci-fi, but I liked it better than I thought I would. I guess I liked the character beats, and it didn't quite bother me as much, the, you know, scant world building in this case. Also because there's some repeating motifs with the characters. We're always following a sort of young, somewhat prophetic young boy named Leo. We have a older young man named Simon, who's on the cusp of life in some way. And then finally we have Catherine, or Kat, or Catherine, who is the woman of the story and is trying to come into her own in certain ways. You know, the future story is somewhat the most different, because 2 of these characters are now not human anymore. And ultimately, the contemporary story is really what grabbed me about this book, and maybe elevated it for me beyond its merits even, I don't know, because I loved what he did with Kat, the forensic psychologist. I just, we were in her head as she was dealing with this issue, and it's like a police procedural, but it's also just about her own personal backstory and trauma, and what it is that she is a middle-aged black woman living alone. She lost her own child, and how that impacts her, and how it influences how she connects to these children who are committing these crimes. So I think it really is the character work, and the rest of it, I just, you know, the plot stuff I could easily have take a back seat. And yeah, then we have the, you know, the first storyline at the turn of the 20th century, where it's, you know, Simon is the young man who is killed in an accident at the factory where he works, and his brother gets it into his head, and maybe it's true, because this is kind of surrealist, that the machine ate him, and he takes on a position there, and he is trying to save Catherine, who is his brother's fiance, because he's starting to see a prophetic vision of, you know, something similar happening to her. And this is the one where Walt Whitman actually is a real character who bumps into them briefly. But yeah, you know, so, you know, it was interesting. I think really it's the writing that got to me the most in this one, that I just could, well, honestly, I did listen to it on audio, but still, I think it's the writing that just swept me away. Here's another strange audio listen for me. This is Isola by Allegra Goodman. I say this is strange because there's a lot about this book that's strange for me with an author who is actually pretty familiar to me. This isn't the first time that Allegra Goodman has kind of gone off reservation, as it were, and tried her hat in a new arena. She's written some YA, some kind of speculative fiction as well, but she's mostly a contemporary literary fiction writer, but not in this case. This is a historical fiction novel, and I was very well received, I think, ultimately, although it's not on the BookTube Prize long list contention list, which somewhat surprises me. But anyway, moving on from that, it is the story based off of reality/hearsay about a 16th century French noblewoman who was marooned with her lover and her nurse on an island near New Canada. Her cousin and her guardian and the person who was in charge of her wealth marooned them there for well, you know, reasons that could either be about him just wanting to take more control of her fortune to, you know, for his own ends, or it could be about his religious fervor, because possibly she and this man, and definitely in this story, they were having an affair. So for whatever reason, they are marooned on this island, and she shockingly survives a couple of years and then is brought back to Europe by some Basque sailors who find her there. And I think this is all hearsay that, like, it appears in French stories around the time, like, oh, I met this woman and it happened, but, you know, it's not necessarily confirmed by recorded history, but it's an interesting premise. I think, you know, there were a couple of things I liked most about it. I did like the relationship between her and her guardian, who was psychologically abusive, but just the way that we went out about trying to understand how he was trying to tear her down and how she was trying to, you know, maintain her sense of self, especially in a world where she had to rely on him. That was interesting to me, sort of the push and pull there. And then it was, you know, intriguing to see how, you know, she could survive. It turned into a little bit of a survival story, although at the same time, part of me was thinking, well, you know, they had far fewer creature comforts, or at least technological creature comforts than I did, so maybe that made it a little easier. Although then, of course, you know, that's just such a glib thing to say, because, you know, the elements are still horrible. They're still, you know, so far abandoned from everything they ever knew. And two of the people, you know, ultimately did succumb to issues. But anyway, I found it an intriguing story, but very different from her usual fare. I don't think it had her usual sort of lyricism and character work. I don't know if maybe I was missing something, because this is also the first time I've listened to Allegra Goodman on audio rather than read her. So maybe it's possible that I'm missing something and it just feels different to me, but this did feel different to me. An interesting different, but different. Now moving into my only nonfiction book on the list, we have Queering Rehoboth Beach by James T. Sears. The subtitle is Beyond the Boardwalk, which is humbling to me because I've been, my family and I vacationed at Rehoboth Beach for decades, and, you know, as sporadic summer guests for a week, although now we do have family friends who live in Rehoboth Beach, but my real understanding of the place is not really beyond the boardwalk. It's a very tourist understanding I have of this place, so I was grateful to read this book and read a little bit more about the history in broad strokes, like about the Methodist camp beginnings of Rehoboth Beach back in the 19th century, and then stuff having to do with the build-up of queer culture, and the clashes with the conservative homeowners organization, but mostly about the buildup of the culture and, you know, how they came and it became a place where a lot of queer owners created restaurants and actually broke new ground in terms of food offerings. And there were also other retail shops and so forth that, that was the community of a lot of queer owners that were involved in that. That stuff really intrigued me. And, there was reference given to homophobia, to the reaction to the AIDS crisis. And also, I think when you're looking at any American residential area, you can't really ignore the impact of racial politics and how there's this whole unincorporated part of Rehoboth called West Rehoboth, where most of the black people live. And the fact that they weren't included with Rehoboth proper, including like the queer community and the queer community, means that they didn't get to benefit from a lot of the upward mobility. Although by now, by this point, it's interesting to say what the culture of Rehoboth is, because it is so expensive that only certain groups of people can afford to live there. And like it has become, like the reputation is, it's a place for people like in DC and Philadelphia and so forth to retire to if they have the means to. So there's a lot going on. There's also, gay publications, there's gay drag volleyball, there's ultimately some gay politicians who start to run for office. And now it's like Rehoboth is maybe like a little blue dot in a much more conservative state of Delaware, or at least the Suffolk County of Delaware. And maybe you have slight knowledge of Rehoboth Beach, because that is actually where Joe Biden also owns a home. So those are just some things to recommend this, but otherwise, it is chock full of intriguing interviews, but, it is so chock full of those interviews that I can find it a little overwhelming. So it's never quite my favorite, most, innovative form of nonfiction, but, it packed a punch. I'm going to be more critical of this book, and I really just brought it on myself. This is Fake Accounts by Lauren Oyler, which I made into my December page 112 tag pick, my other TBR game. I made it that because I was able to find it on audiobook, and I didn't have enough time to read another physical book, so I listen to audiobooks in transit and that sort of thing. And I had a feeling from page 112 and from reviews that this would not really be for me, and it's my own fault that this happened, that I read it, although in a way I'm kind of relieved now to just get it off my shelves. This is a book that takes place shortly after Trump's first presidency starts, and it is very much autofiction. It might just be sort of social media streamline fiction about Lauren Oyler. At least in terms that her main character is about her age and has the type of career she has, where her professional life is mostly about, talking about culture and talking about politics online. That's basically what she does, probably more cultural than politics. Then she moves to Berlin and now lives somewhat between the U.S. and Berlin. In this story, the reason she moves to Berlin is because of a boyfriend. And at the beginning of the story, she's wanting to, separate from this boyfriend. And honestly, I think the reason is that both of these people are just so self-involved that they're not in a relationship at all. So of course they want to separate. But she wants to do it so that she can maintain a narrative where she feels good about herself. And so she's convinced herself, with some merit, that something seems off about him. And it turns out, she finds out through, going through his phone, that he has a secret Instagram account where he's this famous conspiracy theorist. And so she goes off to the Women's March, the first Women's March after Trump's presidency, to try to figure out, how am I going to separate from him? And also she has to be part of the cultural moment and that sort of thing. And then he has a freak accident where he actually dies, so I guess that solves that problem. And she ends up going to Berlin because she feels like she's out of sorts with her trundling little life, and so she wants to be an expat in Berlin, except she kind of hates being an expat in Berlin where she only hangs out with other expats, and she wants to prove that she's better than her boyfriend at being an expat, except she knows she doesn't know German, so who else is she going to hang out with? And, there were some aspects of this book that I was okay with, that, I thought there were some fleeting moments where, I thought she had some interesting ruminations on sort of cultural milieus and, people just in her generation trying, and I guess my generation trying to act human. And listening to it on audio, I think, was a much better choice because it's so rambling that it's just easier to like just hear it. But ultimately, it just, I was just so ready for it to be done. I don't even know how it ended. Did it end? Does it matter? Does it matter how any of this ends? I don't really think so. And I had a feeling that's exactly what this would be. I'm not sure why I thought that I didn't like this book and why I picked it up exactly. But I did, I think, write a slightly snarky review, which I find fun to do. And maybe that makes me more like her than I think. I mean, because I am also a too chronically online millennial, and I don't even have much to say in terms of it being for professional reasons. But anyway, that is this book. And finally, I'll talk about Someone to Run With by David Grossman. So yeah, this is Israeli fiction from also around, well, I'd say post 9/11, but I guess in this parlance it's more like post Oslo Accords, except that this isn't a political novel. You know, I did read Grossman's essays on Israel and Palestine earlier this year, and his nonfiction is much more political than his fiction usually, except when it comes to my favorite of his books, To the End of the Land, which I'm not sure, I don't think it's here, you can't see it. But anyway, it's up there, and it's definitely a political novel. This is not a political novel, but I liked it. I liked it. It is a book about two teenagers, turn of the 21st century, Jerusalem teenagers. We're introduced to Asaf. He has this sort of menial job at the sort of city council in Jerusalem that his parents got him while they're abroad visiting his sister who's about to get married. So they just want him to have something to do over the summer. He's 16. And so at one point there's this stray dog, who we later learn is named Dinka, who is brought there, and his boss says you have to, you know, track down the owner to pay. They have to pay a fine. And in a move that feels like it only happens in fiction, frankly, the dog leads him around to people she, Dinka, knows, and that's how we start to get immersed into the story of her owner, Tamar. Tamar is about the same age. She is this actually very good opera singer. She belongs to a group that's about to go tour in Italy. This is kind of a big thing for her, but her brother, who has been missing for a while, calls. He is addicted to heroin, and he's in desperate need of help, and it is obvious that he is beholden to some nefarious people. And so she decides to take herself and her music to the streets, because he's involved with a pickpocketing group where they actually do use kids and teenagers with abilities as a sort of front, like to, you know, do street shows, that sort of thing. So she ultimately finds her way to this group and finds her brother and is looking to, you know, escape with him. So we're getting that story bit by bit, where we're also getting Asaf's story of trying to track her down. And there's a little bit about Asaf too. He has a sort of toxic friendship with this jerk kid at school that he basically has to get over that and, you know, realize he's a good enough guy on his own. And I think his ultimate relationship with Tamar, as it happens, is his way of doing that. And so there's a lot in this story that I think feels like it could only happen in fiction, but it's also very feel-good. And because I think in the US we can only really talk about David Grossman through the prism of politics, and especially Israeli-Palestinian politics, which are, you know, directly absent from this book, but we still talk about, or I read one review, you know, that really took to heart the idea that this was about two people that, you know, against all odds could come together for something better for themselves. And so that is sort of the dovish hope for, you know, the conflict as well. But just in general, there's a somewhat feel-good quality about this. It also kind of reminded me of the movie August Rush, because it's another child musical prodigy who gets caught up a little bit with, you know, an underground world with a thief. And also there's this happy ending at the end where he wants to reunite with his parents, and that happens in a sort of magical way, the way that these people can find each other as well. And that about covers it for me now. Hopefully that made some sort of sense. I think I rambled on more than I thought because I can see my battery going down a little bit, so oi. But anyway. I am onward and upward into January of reading, so expect me back here on this channel with my first TBR game, which is my quarterly booktube spin, which I've already pre-filmed because I get very excited about these things, so stay tuned for that. I hope all of you who are commemorating MLK weekend in the US, through service, through time off, through whatever you are doing, are having a meaningful time of it. Hopefully you're getting some good reading in as well. And thanks so much for watching, everyone. I'll see you next time.